And Miles, and I agree with Miles when he said that this has been an amazing conference and an amazing ability to actually learn some things and apply them. I hope that you will indulge me, though, in this last session, because I'm going to perhaps take this up a couple of levels and actually going to be talking about international development, international global development, and how ICT, in the form of connections, transformation, and innovation, is actually making a huge difference around the world. I have to say thank you to Peter for his patience because he has been trying to get me to come to this event, if not speak at this event, for about 5 years now. And for various reasons, this year actually worked for both of us. And so I thank you, Peter, for keeping after me and your patience. So I have, in my career, have had an amazing opportunity to travel around the world, to basically look at what is working inside government and outside government, in the public sector and private sector, and now in the nonprofit NGO world, and actually kind of pull out, extract the secret sauce of what makes so much of that innovation work. And I was very honored to have been applying that secret sauce, if you will, for President Obama, and now I'm doing it on an international stage with the World Bank. For those of you who may not know what the World Bank is, it is the bank or the organization that basically was set up after World War II to reconstruct Europe. And that reconstruction was done roughly around 1960, and the bank reimagined itself. It pivoted, and it then took on the sole duty, the sole purpose of eradicating poverty around the world. What the bank does is provides two things. One is knowledge. There are economists and lawyers and government officials who do countless studies that create the data that oftentimes people like me use in our presentations, really kind of capturing the essence of what's going on in the world. But the other part of the bank, and what I'm going to be talking about today, is actually the operational part of the bank. The bank is a bank. It loans money. It loans billions of dollars of money. We are in every region of the world, and we are in fragile states. We are in emerging economies, developing countries, Nigeria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia. We are in some of the toughest places. And my job, I've been with the bank all of 6 months, it's a brand new position, is to figure out how to take technology and help the bank understand how technology can transform this venerable institution, but also, and again, more importantly for the talk today, figure out how we use it to enable our customers, the countries that borrow from us, and actually implement the change that we work together to create. When I travel around the world, no matter if I'm talking to Prime Minister Medvedev in Russia, the Minister of Finance in any country, or Minister of ICT, or the CIO of the United States of America, these are the 4 topics that continuously come up. The objectives, if you will, the goals: economic growth and job creation, a more efficient and effective government, and the fact that there's usually some social policy change that needs to be addressed, whether that be anti-corruption, whether that be more women in the workforce, whether that means preventing genocide. All of those are the social goals. We are, as a bank, focused on one thing, as I said, poverty reduction. But very specifically, we are focused on the parts of the world where people live on $1.25 a day. This is considered extreme poverty. And in addition to focusing on countries where the population subsists on $1.25 a day, we're also focusing on other parts of the world where we're 40% of the bottom part of the population needs some type of assistance. So we are focused on the poorest of the poor, and in that space, we focus on just a couple of countries that I want to talk about specifically. The red is where the most of the poorest of poor live, and sub-Saharan Africa actually is where the most concentrated numbers of people in poverty live, and parts of Asia is where the more people actually live that are in that space. But we do three things. We connect. In this case, we are building or financing the transatlantic cabling connecting much of this part of the world. We also connected Africa to the internet. In essence, we loan money to individual countries or countries and actually connect them to the rest of the world. I like to say we light up the world. We go where private sector doesn't want to go. We transform governments and the lives of people. This woman named Sarah has just made $172 because the application on her phone, not a smartphone, a regular SMS phone, she's been able to understand how she could sell her crop for more money than she was being offered in her local city by using something called eSoko, an electronic marketplace that is sponsored by governments. Or, from an innovation standpoint, using crowdsourcing and mapping technologies to rapidly help governments understand the problems that they face. This is a map of a slum in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania that was created by asking the very people in that slum who live there to help the government actually come up with a first ever map of the slum and what's located in there. It's all about innovation. This is a map done by IDEO, but it's really that center part that I'm going to talk about today, the experience of innovation and how we can apply it to solving new and different problems. And if there's one thing that I would like to leave you with today, if there's one thing that you will remember about my speech, it is the following things. There will never be enough money in government. There will never be enough resources. We will never have the right technology. We will never have the right trained people to solve the problems that we're being asked to solve. The only way that experience is telling us is to actually let go and realize that and say that what we can do is actually enable the platform to be built so that other people can take the data, the information, the knowledge that we have and create value on top of it, to actually solve the problems, to envision the future, and to solve the problems that we can't ourselves. The second is that in order to do that, we must tap into the community. The community becomes the capacity to do what we need it to do. The private sector has known for a long time that the key to this is understanding customer and customer needs, and something that we in government don't do a very good job at. And finally, what technology is allowing to happen is the empowerment of the individual, and that empowerment process has the potential to fundamentally change the relationship between government and those it governs in ways that we are just now beginning to understand. But we are potentially seeing the beginnings of a new type of democracy, a new type of governance structure, which we'll get to in the session after my talk. When I try to capture all of that, lessons learned, all of that, I come up with 11 different ways that innovation is used or can be used that is enabled by technology to fundamentally change that construct. So the first is identify the problem. Albert Einstein is, at least it was attributed to Albert Einstein, that if he was given 1 hour to solve problems before the world ends, how would he spend his time? And he said he'd spend 55 minutes identifying the problem and 5 minutes on the solution, which is precisely the opposite of what we do every day. We always, and I do this too, jump to the solution before we understand the problem. I'd like to talk about one way that is evolving to help address that issue, and that is by using the hackathon, our lovely little hackathon, in a new way. The World Bank sponsored a hackathon in sanitation. In the world, 6 billion people have access to smartphones, to phones, cell phones actually, not smartphones, cell phones, and 4.5 billion do not have access to proper sanitation. 4.5 billion of us do not have access to sanitation, which is the beginning of so many issues from education, health, transportation. It is one of the key issues around the world. This is an example of an open sanitation pool in Tanzania. What we did was a typical hackathon where we had a weekend where people came together and they did the kind of eat pizza, drink beer, come up with problem statements. But we decided that that wasn't really enough. What we wanted to do was create a worldwide conversation with actual change associated, sustainable change. So we did this sanitation hackathon over a year. And as you can see, 188 projects, 132 problems, but it's the 132 problems that actually what I want to focus on here. When we looked at the discussion and saw that there are so many categories of problems associated and different functions that can be used, we realized that what actually could happen in a hackathon is not the shiny application at the end, although that is what we did, but actually the process of problem definition, of getting people to understand what we're dealing with and understand very specifically the problems to be solved. So this is an example of that problem process. And we had 3 problems: a crisis statement, a need statement, and an impact statement. And for the first time, from a global perspective, we understood with 132 sets of these problems, statements, what we were facing. And it created, for the first time, an international discussion on what needs to be happening, what could be happening to solve this particular problem. This is the winning solution, if you will, comes from the Philippines by a bunch of entrepreneurs. Sun Clean is the name of their company. And they developed an application, or a game actually, for kids to understand how important it is to wash their hands. And we actually, remember the job creation, economic growth, we actually flew the winners of this particular hackathon to San Francisco, where I live, and actually walked them through a week's worth of IDEO training so they could turn their idea into a sustainable company and then go back to the Philippines in this case. Number 2, rethink the approach. What I said was we need to think about problems in new ways and solving them in new ways. After all, if we kept solving the problems the old ways, we wouldn't have problems to solve. I like this quote very much because how many of us work in an environment where policy is the first thing that we talk about? In a rules-based organization, that's where we start. What's the policy? What are we allowed to do? Not how are we going to solve the problem? We end up spending so much time on the left-hand side of this graph when really the solution is on the far right. I guess you're right. How do we break that paradigm? This way. On the left-hand side, you see the kind of the traditional rules-based approach where we start with policy, then we talk about process, then systems, then we get to the user, and then there's something called stasis. What we now have learned is that to truly be effective, we need to move to the other side. We start with understanding the user. Then we build the service or redesign the service, go back to the user, figure out if we got it right, a minimum viable product. We then develop the systems, we go back and get feedback, and finally do the policy check before moving forward. This paradigm shift is so important that in the Obama administration, we actually wrote it into the rules and regulations of our Office of Management and Budget that cover every federal agency in Washington. Because it's not about technology. We spent the last day and a half talking about this. Technology is a tool to solve problems. And oftentimes when you start, the problem you think you have is not actually the problem you have. It's assumptions like we knew it wasn't going to be a smartphone. We thought it was going to be just an SMS texting phone. And what we realized is that in some parts of the world, this is what it is. It's a shared phone hanging from a piece of tape in a tree that is shared by everybody in the village. So I want to walk you very quickly through a process that we went through. This is in Nigeria, and we started with people. We went to where they lived. We explored the local leaders' perspectives. We explored, of course, those processes, talked to local business, and we took all of that knowledge, and thank God for stickies, Post-its. We went on the wall, put it all down, synthesized it, came up with pictures, and you all recognize this, a systems diagram. Systems diagram not based on what we thought, but based on what all of those people told us. We then created user profiles. And then we began our rapid prototyping of turning all of that knowledge into something, that minimum viable product that we knew was not right. We knew it was imperfect, but we took it back out to the people who were going to be using it and said, help us QA this. Help us make this better. We synthesized all that information back, went back out, did some more prototyping, and ended up coming up with an SMS reporting system. Yes, an SMS reporting system. Most of the world, developing world, doesn't have access to smartphones. SMS texting is actually one of the unsung heroes in the developing world. We worked to create visuals. We, of course, talked to the government, but notice, we're now talking to the government at the end of the process, not at the beginning. And what came out of it, in this case, was a web dashboard that created, for the first time, services, the delivery, the availability of services in Nigeria. Third, scan for opportunities. We've spent the last day and a half, and I'm not going to go into this, talking about the technology and what's happening around the world. This happens to be a picture of users of Facebook, and you can see that developing world is quite heavily a user of Facebook. Developing world, not so much. But this is the real key. 6.8 billion people in this world have a cell phone. There are people in Africa who spend 75% of that $1.25 a day on their cell phone. They go without food so they can have their cell phone. Cell phones, cell technologies have enabled Africa to leapfrog over many of their problems, and the solutions are amazing. But this is what I want to talk about, 3D printing. Because with 3D printing, as the printers come down, and as people use more and more 3D printing, we are going to see the individual, back to the empowerment thing, we're seeing the individual actually being able to create products of value anywhere in the world, outside of any trade policy, outside of any industrial policy. We will actually see the individual being able to create anything that you can create using polymers and a printer. In fact, recently there was a surgeon who went on and used a 3D printer to create a valve or a stent that was actually implanted in a child and saved the child's life. You can imagine what this is going to mean for governments and regulations as this moves forward. So I would argue that this is an amazing opportunity, amazing challenge, but amazing opportunity. The last thing I want to say about scanning for opportunities is developed cities in the world, such as this is Chicago, are actually mining their 311 call center data. And they're actually looking at that data and they're predicting future behavior. For example, in Chicago, they are looking at the data from their crime data, and actually predicting where the crime is happening and changing where they're posting their police. This is a picture of their website, and it's what can weeding tell you about sewers. And the point of this is just that you have no idea what different data sets can mean once they're put together, once they're mashed, and actually tell you about what is going to happen within your city. Number 4, craft the intervention. Now we're getting into the fun part. Urban population, by the time I'm done with this speech, in the world will have increased by these numbers: 35 in Europe, 330 in Africa, 800 in Asia. Over the next 25 years, 90% of the population growth in the world will be in cities, 80% of the wealth creation will be in cities, and 60% of the energy consumption will be in cities. Cities are, in many respects, the future of the world. And yet we know cities don't work. I shouldn't say that coming from San Francisco, but it's true. Cities were created in the 1800s as kind of these top-down, siloed organizations that aren't meeting and won't be meeting this kind of need of the citizens. How are we going to change the approach for cities? Because this is what we're seeing. This is the problem we're dealing with. So one of the things that is being discussed, considered, is something called smart city. And for my IBM friends in the audience, I'm not talking about IBM's version of smart cities. What I'm talking about is a holistic approach to cities, where you have government, academia, private sector, and civil society organizations all working together in a bottoms-up, or at least a sideways-in approach to the delivery of services within cities. So we've been working in Colombia, South America. We have 3 medium-sized cities. And what we did was we took a tool created by Korea, a very different model, and we did an assessment of cities. And we worked to identify city priorities. And again, similar to that other example, co-creation and problem identification. And then we co-created the solutions. 200 hackers, hours, concepts, typical model. And we created an urban living lab to actually translate all of those ideas into actionable items and to experiment, to create a fab lab, if you will, to create exactly what Google does, but we're creating it in a city so that we can take all of those ideas, turn them into minimum viable products, and experiment. And we are working with a network of cities around the world to actually create these ideas and share them so that cities don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Execute. Excuse me. This is relating to something from this morning. Our understanding of poverty, and I would argue it's not just poverty, it's everything we do. It's not about scarcity anymore. It's about targeting and distribution. It's about using real-time data and new decision-making tools to solve problems. I tried not to use too many American examples, but this one I think is one of the most fascinating. It's called SF Park. San Francisco is a beautiful city. 750,000 people live in it during the day, but it swells to 1.5 million people during the day. One of the biggest problems it has, very contained city, water around three sides, is parking. It embedded sensors in the city in both its parking spaces on the street and its parking lots. And it is now using that real-time sensor data into a decision-making tool where they now change the pricing for parking and garages depending upon the need or the demand for parking, real-time, and they're able, by that, to move people around the city to park in places where there is available parking, and lastly, on an app, actually tell them where the parking is. This is an experiment. I think there's only about half of the parking spaces in the city in the system. But this is the future of what cities and other organizations will be. It'll be real-time data visualized using applications for instantaneous decisions. For those of you who suffer from asthma, this is an amazing example of where a doctor created a new asthma inhaler, put a sensor on it, and so every time a child or a person uses that inhaler, all of that data goes back to a server, and that server data is analyzed to understand why that child or person actually has an attack, but you can actually expand that to whole communities, as they're doing in Louisville, to actually address their number one health concern of asthma by using a sensor in individual inhalers to create real-time data for which cities can make real-time decisions. And this is an example over in Australia that I'm going to be going to this weekend, where they're doing the same thing, but they're focusing on agriculture. Ask. I want to tell you a story about bananas. I did not know this. I was just there a couple weeks ago. Uganda in Africa is the second largest producer of bananas in the world. And as you can see, 70% of their local food basket is dependent on bananas. However, there's a problem. There's a blight that is attacking the banana trees and has the potential of wiping out the entire crop. Now, they've got ag extension workers who are telling them how to solve the problem, but it turns out that they're giving them the wrong advice. They're telling them to cut down the trees, bury the trees, and that's going to take care of the problem. When in actuality, for those of you who grow orchids, you know that you merely just take care of your cutting utensils and you sterilize them, and that prevents the transmission. But what we did is, working with UNICEF and SMS technology, texted 200,000 people in Uganda who on a daily basis have signed up to be part of a conversation. And we sent them a question and we said, do you know anybody who has suffers from the disease, or do you suffer it from yourself? And within 24 hours, we got 45,000 responses, from which we were able, in 24 hours, to create the first national map of geocoded data of where the blight exists, and then share that with government. Now, you can imagine if government had done that, and I'm not dissing government here, I'm a former recovering government official myself. You know, there would have been an RFP, an RFI, there would have been, you know, months and months of contracting, and, you know, maybe in a year you'd have gotten what we were able to do within 24 hours is get 25,000 people to respond by simply asking them. And as a result, I believe we will, in essence, save Uganda from financial collapse. This is actually a picture of both the president of the UN and the president of the World Bank and a U reporter talking about the project. The other thing I want to say, again, I try not to do too many US examples, is that what President Obama did was create something called the Presidential Innovation Fellows. And the idea here is that when government faces a problem, we oftentimes divorce ourselves, prevent ourselves from actually accessing the knowledge and information and capacity within the community, and we end up in our silos being afraid to ask for help. What President Obama said is, enough is enough, stop this. Let's bring innovators, let's bring people from outside government people, marry them with inside government people, give them a focused task, give them 6 months to solve it, and oh, by the way, come to Washington, D.C. and do that for free. The response was overwhelming, and we created these teams that, interestingly enough, one of the first things we focused on was procurement. Not shying away from big, hairy, audacious goals, we focused on procurement, and specifically, how do we get more small to medium-sized businesses to compete with the big boys and girls to actually get government contracts? And we brought people from the community, and we broke all the rules, but we're actually getting teams to solve problems that we couldn't solve by ourselves. Provide the space. This is really about open data. And it truly is a global movement. It's amazing how many states, cities, countries are opening up their data. Back to that platform issue I talked about releasing the data and letting other people create economic value with it. This is data.gov. Data.gov, which is the US version. There's data.gov UK. There's data.gov Ghana. It's an amazing thing around the world. What we've come to know is that you just can't release data in order for it to be used. You actually do have to organize it around subject matter areas and make it easy to use. One of the things I'm most proud of from my time in the White House was simply creating not data.gov in and of itself, but actually taking it down to cities, counties, and states, so that for the first time we have that platform, a common platform of available data, government data at all levels of government. Because as we know, individuals don't care what level of government is actually producing the product or service. They just want their needs to be met. And so for the first time in the United States, from a government perspective, we have literally over 750,000 data sets now of different government entities being released to the public. We're also looking at the private sector. This is a case of an energy company where I'm from in California, and we're actually convincing energy companies to release their data to the public on energy usage. And we're working with the entrepreneurial community to actually take that data and build solutions. This is a slide from Health Data Palooza 4. And what's interesting about this is this has become so successful now that we rent out the convention center in Washington, D.C., and have people compete in American Idol kind of fashion for the privilege of showing off their businesses that they're creating based on the release of government data. And we focus on this one on health, but it is happening in all sectors: energy, education, health, manufacturing. Animate the public. The United States just recently, in May, released a whole new digital data strategy. And what I want to show here is just simply the fact that they are helping agencies launch applications that will showcase solutions to problems. Kenya is actually taking the budget data and actually making it look understandable so that citizens can visualize the budget and how it's being spent. This is one of my favorite examples. We actually, in San Francisco, took the health inspection data and gave it to Yelp, so that if you go to Yelp and look at restaurants in San Francisco, you will actually see their health scores as part, for the first time, as part of the description of that restaurant. Huge, huge challenges with that one. But actually, the response has been overwhelmingly positive from restaurants and users alike. Another example from San Francisco, we have a problem with reaching the disaffected youth. So we ended up going to a gaming company and creating a game. And this is an example of the avatars, the docent from the museum actually teaching kids in a virtual reality using data from the museum and actually teaching kids, reaching kids for the first time in Boys and Girls Clubs, after school organizations, and actually getting them to engage in subject matters that they would never do on their own and never have an ability to do. Leverage social media. I'm not going to spend much time. We talked a lot about this. This is actually Facebook. Check My Schools. This is the ability to actually keep track of school problems using an automated method and using Facebook, Twitter as ways of contributing data. This is an example of data being used from various parts of the United States when Hurricane Sandy hit. And this map was created based on the data of both public sector and private sector and nonprofit organizations, all pooling their data in order to keep it current and provide the most up-to-date information. Focus on results. This is from Kenya. And what they did, I should say, was actually take the data and make it visible by making a map of it and showing the change in primary students with passing grades. But then we actually took it down a level and talked about where in specific schools the most change was taking place and provided by school the individual information so that people could understand what was happening for their students. The last one is be the first to take the risk. And one of the things that I like most about this example, this is from the city of Boston, is that we talked a little bit about this morning. Risk-taking behavior is simply not reinforced in most of our government agencies. It just doesn't exist. What neurourban mechanics did was create a change where if you have an idea, a minimum viable product, something that you want to change, but you're afraid to do it, you take it to an organization within the mayor's office and the CIO, Bill Oates in Boston, and you present your idea to them. And if they buy your idea, so to speak, they will fund you. And if the project doesn't make money, if it has a political issue, if it has a service delivery issue, you are absolved of the responsibility for that. They're so sure of their ability to understand and approve what works that they are putting taxpayer dollars and the mayor of Boston's reputation on the line in order to support their own workers. And you can about imagine how popular this program has been. So, again, 4 takeaways. We can't do it all, so we need to create a platform. We need to invite others, public sector, private sector, nonprofits, civil society, everybody into the party. We need to focus on understanding customer needs and wants. And we have now the ability to do that. We now have data. We now have real-time data. We now have the ability to use new decision-making tools to do that, with the idea that empowerment is the sole purpose. Because much of what happened in the Arab Spring is government not understanding that citizens, individuals, now are connected around the world. They have access to information, they share it, and they will use it. And going back to this morning's Peter's discussion, we are heading for a new definition of what government looks like. It may not happen in the next 5 years, but in the next 10, certainly in the next 20. And we, as technology leaders, will be helping to guide this revolution forward. Technology will enable democracy, in my opinion, to actually work the way it was intended to work.